Good afternoon and welcome to this week's Sonar Market Insights webinar. We have our resident expert, Zach Strickland, aka the Sultan of Sonar, joining us today. I am Brad Ganane, back from a little hiatus. You guys got to enjoy Michael Crosby last week, so that was a very lucky and a nice little appearance that he made. At any rate, we are going to go ahead and get started with Zach. Going over, I think we added a couple new things this week. We're going to go over those quickly and then, of course, give you some insight into how you hopefully use them, depending on the various operations that may be affected by these new data sets, and then also most likely jump into a brief little market update where we're at, especially with all of this crazy weather hitting the Midwest and parts of the Northeast. But to kick it off, I think we're going to talk violations with Zach here. So go ahead and get us started.
So not a big addition of data this week. We have two.
What?
We have, in terms of quantity.
Okay, good.
Young Brad, you've been on vacation. So we've got two new indices that we added. These are more kind of going to give a little bit more depth to the information that we have already. We talked about additional violations, FMCSA data last week. We've added one more value to that this week, the violations to inspections ratio. And this was actually brought on at a request of one of our chief analytics people who used to drive a truck. And he says that this is extremely insightful for those out there that are operating trucks. What it is the ratio of violations to inspections. So what you're looking at right now is 1.65 violations per inspections. Wow, how can it be greater than one, you might ask, Brad? Well, it's because you can get multiple violations for every inspection. So the value in this is if you are an owner-operator or asset-based carrier or somebody just curious and looking to know more about some risk management and compliance, you can go into certain states and see, one, how many violations are happening at any given time, as well as inspections. So I think California is probably one that most people are going to have a reaction to, at least in my experience. So we offer this by state as well as U.S. granularities. And there,
less than one.
Yeah, I meant to put that on here so we can actually, I'm going to do this on a absolute scale. So change it over here. Absolute, not relative. Absolute. So violations per inspections here, we've got a 0.99. So every time you get pulled over, you're probably going to get I mean,
there's no getting around it.
Yeah. And so we offer this on a monthly basis. We're going to give you an idea of when the best time of year to operate in any kind of state is.
Oh, so by the time of the year, huh?
Yeah, so it's going to give you a good idea of when, I think June is pretty aggressive with their, you have that 1 week out of the year.
DOT week?
Yes. Sorry, I went blank for a minute.
That's what I'm here for.
But they're a little bit more efficient here in August, so watch out.
So you would look at that state by state potentially, or if you're operating pretty regularly, let's say I have 100 trucks and we have customers that typically take us from Chicago to Dallas and Chicago to Atlanta back and forth.
Well, look at this right here. I mean, everybody thinks California's harsh. Actually, Texas is far more harsh to operate in. They're going to give you about 3 violations for every inspection that they have. And again, we have tons of violation data on here at this point. If you want to dig any deeper into, these are reported to the DOT. There's your total violations, monthly violations, if you're looking for that in relation to this. They do it by state highway mile, so you know kind of how exposed you are. And then, the type of violations, things that end up out of service. Then we added a few things last week in terms of hazmat and controlled substances. driver fitness compliance, which
Oh,
honestly, I didn't even know this was a thing.
what is it? Please do tell.
No, I seriously, I was like, I'm not even sure what that could possibly be, except for, I didn't think that you could have that kind of violation. Hours of service, obviously, these are pretty interesting. But we added these last week, and this is just going to be kind of an addition to that, letting you know how likely are you to get a citation when you get pulled over in these states.
So is that something that you could operationalize? Would you want to take that into consideration when deciding, planning your network, when looking into even on a quoting basis and understanding, risk in areas, in and out of areas, or how would you actionalize this data, if you will?
Sure if that's a word, but I know what you're saying. So how can I make this actionable? Well, to me, from a pricing standpoint, the states that are obviously have these higher ratios, they're going to be the ones that I'm going to incur a little bit more risk. If I'm operating heavily in Texas, for instance, I'm probably going to get pulled over and cited a lot more. Ironically, I would have thought California too, but just to kind of pull back down, I'm going to pull up our risk management and the total violations. Let's see here.
Is that percent of out of service? And just for our listeners, I did get a smile out of Zach when I made up that word. So that was the goal.
You won.
Accomplished.
You won today.
And even your voice, it cracked a little bit. I sensed a little excitement in the smile. It caused a little excitement in your voice too. So that's always good.
It was. So here's the percent of out of service violations. As you can see, they kind of coincide with the highest peaking volume months. Right now, we haven't, we're not going to see a lot of out of service violations in the month of January, but a lot of that has to do with the fact that everything's just slower in January, including the enforcement officers. They aren't trying to be as active, just like trucks are not as active in that time period. But you could dig into this and you could kind of glean in certain states specifically how you're exposed. There's a lot of carriers out there and a lot of brokerages that, actually operate within a certain real specific geographic area. Like depending on your shippers, if you're a broker, you're going to have a lot more exposure to this, or if a carrier, I should say. I mean, you're going to have a lot more exposure to things depending on your shippers that you operate with. I mean, if I'm going to be dealing a lot with things out of Atlanta, I'm looking at Georgia, I'm looking at Texas, and you can take this kind of stuff into account when pricing, as well as just knowing that operationally. There's lots of people out there that, I know I used to talk to a lot of my ops guys, and I'd always ask them for operational information in order to kind of mitigate some of this risk with the rates that I'd put in there. Obviously, the market dictates a lot of that, but at the same time, this kind of gives you a little bit more depth to your discussion with your customers. Say, look, guys, it costs me a lot more money to operate in Texas. The violations that, every time I get inspected, I get 2.5 violations, which costs me a driver to be out of service. And I think it's kind of ironic that we pulled up the percent of out of service violations. You can see the trend is actually to go up. It's actually heading up as we go further and further into the future here.
I like it. The more you know. The more you know. That's what we're here.
No.
Let's jump into. And are you done on this?
So
I know this is one of your favorite. This is one of your favorites. So I want to provide enough time to.
We should at least go into the one other index that we added this week, the rail traffic originated total carload. So what this is basically everything that's not intermodal. So if you're just looking for rail traffic in general that's not intermodal, and you want to know how much has been shipped.
What do you mean rail traffic in general that's not intermodal? What do you mean by that?
So things like coal, coke, chemicals, grains, things that kind of ship in bulk.
So not in a container.
Exactly.
40 foot. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. So dry goods and things like the palletized freight that goes on containers, floor loaded stuff that's going on a container. Sure. This is going to be your coal, your kind of raw materials. You can see that the trend in this is actually going, I mean, it's kind of down, but also something I didn't know, but rail really suffered here when the economy was down. We thought freight was bad in 2016 for trucks, but rail actually had a bad year too. Coal has traditionally been their biggest kind of like that pays the best. It's the highest volume or whatever. But over the last few years, that has not been the case at all. Intermodal's really kind of taken over. I think anybody that's dealt with rail knows that they really don't like hauling intermodal, kind of operationally speaking. They like it. The investors love it because it's lots of volume and it means that they're in demand and they're getting a lot more money. But the operational people, it's kind of a pain. It wears out their rail cars and everything like that. So there's a lot more operation included in handling that intermodal freight versus, say, a coal car that they can just have pouring out of the overhead, the stuff that kind of pours it into the car, like the grains and all that stuff. And this is what that is. That's everything that's basically not hauled in a container. You can see it's interesting. It's kind of flat over the last little bit, but it's still kind of on the long run trending down. And I can kind of compare this to our TOIC since I have kind of talked about.
So we're comparing it to the container, the rail.
Yep.
Rail container.
There you go. They're on. See how the total carloads has come down and the intermodal has kind of been rising. That's the capacity that they're taking up on the rails. So intermodal is starting to drive more, even though you hear all the time about, I know you hear this all the time with your Rail Times Monthly that you read. That
my subscription?
Yeah.
Do you mean on the app or the one that I get in the mail?
Either one. I can't keep up with you. The rails kind of want to constrict their exposure to this intermodal because it slows down their operation. So they won't offer intermodal service between certain cities, like Memphis to Pennsylvania, for instance. They'll turn down, they'll say no more intermodal here, but it's typically on their lower volume lanes. Anyway.
That's interesting though, because I think we get, being on, and you certainly, I know, talk to a lot of our customers as well, but that's a question that I'll get quite often is okay, how does this tell me what's going on with intermodal, or how does your trucking data, or how does the intermodal affect the trucking or over the road stuff? And I think to that point, I don't know if you want to elaborate on it a little bit more, but I think that's a really interesting point, in correlation that could be drawn.
Yeah, no, I mean, the intermodal side of things, in terms of our tender rejection data, tender volume data, that is buried in there. It is, and this is over the road intermodal. This is stuff that hops off the train and is now on a truck.
You're right.
On a different chassis. It's not it's not something that we're not tracking the rail on the tender rejection. This is the stuff that has potentially hopped off the rail. Most of it obviously doesn't necessarily get transloaded by container, literally like a Schneider or JB Hunt pulling the container off of the rail car onto the chassis of the trailer. But a lot of our stuff legitimately goes into some sort of transloading facility where they then palletize the goods and then they put them on a dry van trailer.
Right.
We do have the intermodal containers in our data and the tender rejections if they are tendered that way.
Sure.
If they are tendered as a container load going from Los Angeles to Chicago, for instance, that will show up. But if it's supposed to go on the rail, it will not show up in there.
Okay. So will this decrease in our rail traffic, other carloads? So our, we'll call them our coal, grain, things of that nature, the decrease in those commodities shipping over the rail and the increase of the intermodal, how would you say that the increase in intermodal, how would that affect over the road? Or are they all three tied together? How would you, or are one or two of them? I think you showed that these two seem to be, but is there anything that you can glean from, to steal your word, one of your favorite words. Glean. From some, what's happening in the truckload markets as well, or over the road, I should say.
Yeah, you can certainly glean a few things, but I kind of pulled up just something I kind of wanted to expand on first.
Okay.
Total carloads. I pulled up rail traffic originated by chemicals and coal, and you see how these essentially are gonna add up to this number up here.
Oh, okay.
So just to kind of expand on that a little bit. So you see the intermodal is basically competing with this space on the rail. Gotcha. Rails love this type of freight because it is very simple to deal with for them. They don't have to deal with rail yards and drayage and things like that, pulling stuff off of a train. The intermodal stuff is cumbersome for them to deal with. There's additional steps and all that kind of thing. But to your question, I think as rails haul more and more intermodal, that's kind of, for trucking companies, that's going to be one of those things that they're going to see more in shrinking their length of hauls as they're more willing to take things longer distances, Los Angeles to Chicago, Los Angeles to Memphis. But inevitably, a lot of that freight gets off on a truck. So as the intermodal kind of volume increases, you can kind of look to those railhead areas more heavily. That's kind of the way I look at it, is Memphis, Chicago, Atlanta, Los Angeles, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, anywhere with a giant rail yard. Those are kind of the markets that are going to become more impacted over time. I think we've seen Los Angeles all year long kind of grow. Like, this was a huge container year for them, as now they're repositioning all their freight.
Right.
So is there anything real pointed that we can take from this? Is just essentially it's going to be more of a generalized, how good is intermodal doing in the country right now? As that number continues to go up in relation to this total carload number, the rail is going to take more and more of an interest in making their operation more conducive to handling that type of freight, which will shorten carriers' length of hauls. But it's also a good way to kind of measure how much freight is the surface transportation market handling right now, because sometimes people will start shipping more heavily on the rail versus trucks. And so that kind of ebb and flow action, as people get fed up with the rail service, they'll go back to trucking. And as trucking prices come back down, they'll become more competitive with the rails, and trucking typically has better service. So that'll pull volume away from the rails as well. So that kind of ebb and flow is important to watch.
Definitely. And I think I know we may have talked about it before on here. I think a good data set to look at and to understand what's happening is the LTRI, the long haul tender reject index, is a pretty good one to give you some insight into this relationship. Is that fair to assume? Am I off the wall here? What do you think?
Yeah, no, the rails typically like to haul things long distances. That's the way their networks are set up. So as your length of, like, these long haul moves are the ones that essentially get, I believe they're some of the hardest to cover. You know what? I'm going to go ahead and get my data up here. I'm going to put up all our length of hauls.
So long haul, 800 plus.
Yeah, tweener is the 450 to 800 mile band. Long haul is 800 mile plus. So tweener is actually, I think, the one that's hardest to get coverage in the country. We'll pull up mid haul. Mid haul has actually been, I thought that was just individual cities, but I'm wrong.
Well, I think mid haul's not. I'm going to correct you here, and it's going to be on record, so I'm really going to enjoy this. It's 250 to 499, and our tweener is 5 to 799. 50 miles.
Okay.
Trust me. Believe me. I got it right here.
All right. No, that's cool. No, that actually makes more sense. Because of the way that it takes, a typical driver will drive 500 miles in a day, 500 to 550 miles in a day, if they're going, at a decent clip. Obviously, some of these owner operators can get up to 700 miles in a day. going a little fast as they take the governors off. So yeah, we've got all of these length of haul measures, and the rail heavily competes in this space right here. So as this tender rejection rate stays high, actually long haul and tweener, mid not so much. But again, this is also going to depend on what market it is. Los Angeles, for instance, is going to have a lot longer, like higher length of hauls coming out of that network versus, say, a Nashville, where their typical length of haul can be, you know, is they have a lot more opportunity to haul these shorter haul freight. You know, Charlotte, Atlanta, they kind of bounce between each other. So you're going to have a lot easier time of it out. Whereas out in LA, they don't want to go, you know, the 400-mile band is not, you know, that's going to Phoenix, you know, or not even Phoenix, but you get what I'm saying.
No, I got you. And we're running up on time, but something I know we discussed that we wanted to touch on is some LTL expertise from you. So what can some of the data in here that you look at, what can you use? What do you think is helpful for those that are, you know, heavy in LTL exposure, and what kind of things are interesting to them and can they find useful? And more importantly, why?
Yeah, so LTL networks are based on this hub and spoke measure, far more so than the truckload networks. The truckloads tend to operate between certain cities, but LTL is traditionally like, you know, Atlanta services, you know, these 50 smaller terminals sitting around them. You know, there'll be a Columbus, Georgia, an Athens, Georgia, but all of that freight will get moved from Dallas to Atlanta and then broken into all these smaller trucks going to these little markets, or the smaller markets, I should say. So LTL is exposed to this, what they call the movement between that Dallas to Atlanta is called line haul to them, which is truckload. Like that is a truckload movement. So a lot of the LTL carriers, just like a shipper, have purchased transportation. They will, because sometimes there's imbalances in their network. If they are heavily exposed to a shipper in Dallas, you know, but they don't have anybody in Atlanta, which I know is not a great example because that's not hard to do, but they will outsource a percentage of their trucks cutting from Dallas to Atlanta. It's probably more appropriate going the other direction, actually. But the LTL guys, when the market surges, like it did back here, they get hit just as hard as a shipper does. And to the contrary, like the LTL pricing is insanely more complicated than truckload. But at the same time, they have far less visibility into the truckload market because they are dealing with how do they service their freight. They're very focused on, or at least we were certainly trying to, you know, we had a lot more attention to, okay, we've got to pick this up. We don't just turn down a pallet or two of freight, mainly because we don't know what that looks like on the other side. Like we don't know that we're only gonna have a third of a trailer to cut today going from Atlanta to Dallas. Whereas the truckload guys is like point A to point B. LTL guys are going to pick up that pallet, not knowing that they don't have a full truck going. And then all of a sudden they've got to make service. They call up, you know, carrier A, they start hauling, you know, they'll move it from Atlanta to Dallas at a higher rate than they could serve on their own truck. So knowing when the market is turning is very important to them, because what also will happen is the shippers will cut up their truckload moves and turn them into smaller shipments when they can't get capacity. When these tender rejections go up, that means that the shippers are not getting their loads covered. And if they are getting them covered, they're paying a premium for it. So the way they get around it, even though LTL pricing tends to be higher, it's still not as high as, say, when I think I've told the story about how the rate from Atlanta to Dallas went from 1,700 to 4,000 in a day for us one time. It's not high enough to cover that, because we have set our prices based on that $1,700 load going from Atlanta to Dallas versus the 4,000. We simply can't recover that. So when the market turns and these shippers chop up their truckloads into like these third and quarter load moves, the LTL carriers will pick it up, have it at some sort of, they know to hit below the linear foot rule and below their cubic capacity limits. So it'll kind of skirt through at 6,000 pounds. It looks like an expensive freight bill, but it's still far less expensive than, what they would be paying on the truckload side.
Sure.
So when the market turns like this, it's very important for them to know. I would sit out there and quote stuff and lose money, and I wouldn't have a clue. And that's where the tender rejection and knowing what the market volatility is doing that day. Anytime the market's turning up, LTL or truckload, I mean, they have the same interest, but for different reasons.
Sure.
If that makes sense. When the market gets a little hot, anytime this market does this, but to the contrary, anybody that does have outsourced freight, when the market's cooling off like it is today, we can then go back and know, hey, we can go out into the spot market and actually get the reverse of what happens when it's up here and it's super hot. Gotcha. Like what I would suggest doing, like in my old world, was, you know what, your carriers just gave you like 10, 15% rate increases this last year based on this. Well, now the market's sitting down here. I got two options. I can go back to my carriers and say, hey man, can you cut us some breaks? We're having trouble keeping up with this, this increased pricing, et cetera, et cetera. We got some more offers on the table. Or they can go to the spot market and start kind of ad hocing some of these loads and finding some of these carriers that are sitting in these markets with nothing to haul.
I like it.
Yeah.
We got a couple minutes. We'll open up for questions as we kind of close down. Give us a quick, if you don't mind, weather. What's going on? I know we're seeing some crazy weather in the Midwest right now. Are we seeing any effects? What's happening?
I'm going to pull up good old Chicago for our Chicago fan base. You saw the tender rejections in the country right now. And I'm going to pull this up on the dual screen. And I just want everybody to see this huge jump in tender rejections in Chicago today. The last couple of days, actually. This has been super cold. It's too cold to operate a truck. Negative 25, stuff breaks. That is extreme weather right there. But you also see the volumes have shot up too. Mm-hmm. So I've got the outbound tender rejection index for Chicago kicking up, but I also have the volumes kicking up. It's the end of the month. A lot of stuff is starting, everybody's got to make their monthly quotas. Right. Just this normal pattern that we tend to see, although January has been exceptionally, it's been pretty cold in terms of freight volume, mm-hmm. not necessarily temperatures, but Chicago heating up actually as it pertains to the polar vortex. Yeah, it's kind of contrary. So that's kind of our tidbit for the day in terms of what to look for, because once you can get in, it's going to warm up, I believe, rather rapidly.
I think so.
Over the next little bit. And you're from Chicago, if I'm not mistaken.
At one time.
Yeah.
At one time, yes.
So
happy to be in Chattanooga right now.
Yeah, I bet that feels like a good move.
35 degrees? Not too bad.
Yeah. Whew, it's cold for us. I had to put on the big coat today.
Get out the big coat.
With our epic half-inch snowstorm we had. But anyway, the weather, this type of weather can really mess up, especially since Chicago is such a freight hub. These things will pile up on docks. You miss a day of freight. These shippers don't just shut down. Like right. Target doesn't care what's happening, in the weather. People are going to buy stuff online or Amazon, especially right now. Like they're going to sit in their houses because they didn't go to work.
Yeah.
It's true. And so all this stuff is still going to happen. There's still going to be needs. So these kind of bottlenecks happen, just like on a much smaller scale than, say, a hurricane with Hurricane Harvey or whatever like that. But this is where the weather does have a big impact. And knowing this, we saw this before it even really happened and became news, mm-hmm. is a big deal.
I like it. We maybe have. Did we get to that question? I think we pulled up a data set about the out of service, I believe, right? Or no?
Yes, we did.
Okay,
actually,
so we had one question. Can you get an out of service to inspections ratio, which I believe we showed right after that question came in originally. So that should have, I think we pulled up the data set right after that.
Ironically,
if you have, of course, any further questions, check us out at www.freightwaves.com/sonar. And there's some contact info to get a hold of Zach, myself, and the rest of the team. But I think we'll hang on for a few more minutes in case any questions come across. Otherwise, thanks for joining us. And if you're out in the Midwest, stay inside. And you stay classy. Thank you. Yeah, I think we messed up our initial sign off, and it looks like most of our participants have signed off. So we're going to go ahead and end things for this week. Thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you guys next week at 2 Eastern.